So let me see if I understand this correctly. Morbidly obese Barack Hussein Obama supporter, pen pal, ducks out of work today to go to the Trump rally in Harrisburg. Meanwhile, also in Pennsylvania, supposed Trump supporter SWV doesn't go to work as usual and is pretending to be fishing in the Susquehanna River. Good fucking God. The world really has flipped upside down. SWV, you're a fucking, you're a liberal cunt in conservative clothing. You ain't no Trump supporter. You're voting for Camel Toe. That's who you're voting for, asshole. Good God. That's all. Part 17, folks. We're almost there.
Because she was involved with Sebring since 1964. So that's one major connection. When I spoke to Virginia Graham, I interviewed her, the woman who Susan Atkins supposedly gave her, quote, confession to, which I believe was a coached and arranged meeting, also arranged by the criminal underworld to put across this cover story. Virginia Graham, now think about this for a minute. The woman who coincidentally heard the confession of Susan Atkins, which, as you may know, is what broke the Tate LaBianca.
Battery low.
See, she had been involved with many mafia figure and leaders for decades before that. She was basically a prostitute, a madam. She happened to be the person who heard what the murders were really about, supposedly, from Susan Atkins. She was a friend of Jay Sebring, a friend of Frank Sinatra, a friend of many, a lover of many of these underworld figures. So that's, I believe, who was planted in the prison to take this false confession. So that gives you some idea of the complicity of these people. So that's one direct connection. Jay Sebring also, because he was providing drugs for JFK and Marilyn Monroe, for Peter Lawford, who was also, like Jay Sebring, a sadist who was interested in sadomasochism, and that was one of the bonds of their friendship, and a major drug abuser, Peter Lawford. Because of the mafia connections with JFK, the meetings between Marilyn Monroe and Kennedy were recorded so that the mafia could extort or hold him over his head to make him do the promises that his father had made about Cuba and all that kind of thing. So the mafia actually recorded Monroe and Kennedy intimately, and Sebring in the late 60s or mid 60s, after JFK's murder, would play the tapes at parties of Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe together. It would be like a party favor. And he was kind of a braggart, Sebring, who wanted people to know that he had friends in powerful and sinister places. He never really made any secret of it. It was an open secret. So that's the first connection. One of the murder victims was deeply ensconced in the mafia atmosphere around the Rat Pack and the Kennedy administration, which is, I think, very well known to your listeners. I don't think I have to explain what it's about. Now, why would Vincent Bugliosi want to cover up what the exact nature of these murders were about? I think it deeply gets into many other connections. And I'll just mention one, because we could do an entire show about only the connections between the JFK Warren Commission cover-up and the Manson cover-up, because they're the same personnel. Do you know the name Lawrence Schiller at all?
Part of what I know, yes, is that he was a true crime author.
This is the most significant way to explain the connections between the cover-up of the JFK murder and the cover-up involved in the so-called Manson murders, what the real motive and what the real purpose of these murders were and who was involved with it. Schiller was a friend of Paul Caruso and Richard Caballero, these lawyers who were well known for representing mafia figures like Mickey Cohen and other people and other drug dealers deeply involved on the fringes of the Cielo Drive and Manson circle. Caballero and Caruso became Susan Atkins public defenders. This guy Schiller was a friend of theirs. They brought him in to sell Susan Atkins' story to the Los Angeles Times and to the European media, and basically to spread the cover story to the mass media as widely as possible. And he put his name on basically what was a interview or a transcription of a tape that Atkins supposedly made that told the story of what happened. And that book was called The Killing of Sharon Tate. Now, who was Lawrence Schiller? 2 years before this guy is brought in to present the public its first story of what these killings were about, he was an informant to the FBI working on the side of the Jim Garrison trial, which I'm sure your listeners understand the significance of that. Lawrence Schiller, a lot of people don't know, was the person who put across to the FBI and to the investigators of the Garrison case that Clay Shaw, this New Orleans businessman who Garrison, as you know, claimed was one of the conspirators who funded the Kennedy assassination. You know who he was. Lawrence Schiller is who told the FBI and the Garrison investigators that Clay Shaw's pseudonym in the homosexual underworld of New Orleans was Bernard.
Clay Bertrand, yes.
And that's
Battery low.
a movie by Oliver. Probably how. So he did that. Lawrence Schiller was in Dallas on November 22, 1963. He took one of the most famous pictures of Oswald in the hallway of the police department. He acquired, because he was the business manager for Jack Ruby, even before the murders, he acquired the famous photograph of Ruby killing Oswald and sold it to the media in 1963. So this is an FBI informant who was trying to counter the Garrison investigation. And he also was one of the first people, Schiller, to write a book against against Mark Lane and the people who were criticizing the Warren Commission. He wrote one of the very first books that, basically made it sound like these people are crazy conspiracy theorists, etc.
Now, if I remember correctly, I believe he also co-wrote, or at least collaborated with, Norman Mailer on Oswald's Tale, and then I think he had some involvement with the made-for-TV movie The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Absolutely. It's really amazing the degree which Lawrence Schiller, he's had a very versatile and prolific career as a kind of hustler who gets involved in infamous crimes. O.J. Simpson, Gary Gilmore, he's Johnny on the spot. Yeah, he's the first guy there to get the deal. Let me write the book about it. But the persistent pattern is from the very beginning. This is Jack Ruby's business manager, and he's also the guy who got Jack Ruby in 1967 on his deathbed. He went to record him and basically persuaded Ruby to say there was no conspiracy. He wanted to get that on tape. He put out a record to show it. Now, how come this person who has already had a career from 63 to 67 of arguing against any critic of the Warren Commission, how come he becomes the person who tells the story